Hello and welcome back to class. It's week 6 and we're going to be continuing on with our discussion of new avenues and ventures in the area of strategic management. So this week could be thought of as a continuation of the week 5 venture into the new directions and new theories that are going on in relationship to strategic management, and hopefully you'll see that many of these are built upon existing theories and combining them with additional theories from other fields. And that's kind of where we come up with the idea of a gap. If you can take something that's well established in one field and then bring it to a fine point, and then find another field that you bring it to a fine point through the literature, and you see that the two can then be combined to give a new view of strategic management, and also reflect upon the other field. So it's a matter of combining what we call the synthesis of two existing well-established ideas, and you combine them together and you come up with a new idea. Okay. So we're going to be looking at, again, some additional literature in the field. We'll be investigating the extension of the resource-based theory with the dynamic capabilities and knowledge management view. Actually, again, because resource-based view has been around for over 20 years now, it has gathered its own body of literature around it, which has expanded it and further defined it. So what we'll see, again, is kind of the way that theory is developed, the way that a body of literature develops, the way a field develops, as exhibited through the literature of this particular week. The assignment for this week is based on the literature, a discussion of where the theories are going, where the field is going, how it connects to previous theories, how it connects to the stuff that we looked at last week, and then it will connect to the paper that we're going to be writing to kind of summarize the 3 weeks of literature. Now, last week in the lecture, in the video, I started talking about the dissertation and how there were 5 different pieces to the dissertation. There was an introduction, then there was a literature review where you'll be reviewing at least 2 streams of literature, and I went into more detail about what a literature review would look like and how the streams are combined together. And then in chapter 3 of the dissertation, you explain the methodology. Okay, this is where you talk about the data you're going to collect, the variables you're going to be measuring, how you plan to analyze it. Chapter 4, then, you take the results of your data collection and analysis and present the results, and finally you do an interpretation of what those results actually mean and where the research should go in the future. Okay, so this week what I'd like to talk about is chapter 3, a little bit more about the methodology, because although people seem to think they understand the concept of variables, when it comes down to actually doing it and looking for variables in a study, this turns out to be a little more difficult than it might first appear. So what I'd like to do is just present what you're trying to do. First of all, you're trying to identify variables. Variables are things that take on different values. What are you going to be observing in your study? How are you going to measure those variables? Okay, if we're talking about you're observing people's weight, well, then you'll probably be using some sort of a scale. But how you use, what sort of a scale you can use, or what sort of a instrument you can use to measure things going on in organizations turns out to be a bit more complicated. Then finally, how are you going to collect the data? Okay, you've identified the variables you want to measure, organizational effectiveness or performance. So how are you going to measure that? How are you going to get the data? Once you've decided that, then there are various forms of analysis, statistical analyses that can be performed. And then with regard to variables that might be influencing your data, what sort of assumptions are made with regard to how those affected perhaps the observations that you gathered. Okay, so that's generally what the methodology chapter includes. So the first thing, of course, is to understand what the possible variables can be, and we normally categorize them as being independent variables, dependent, and extraneous variables. So in this particular case, we have an independent variable that seems to be heading out the door with her suitcase, And she says, nothing you do affects me. I'm independent. And Mr. Dependent Variable, sitting in his chair, said, well, some of the things you do affect me. And this is kind of the nature between the two. Independent variables will be changing value independent of the dependent variable, but as the independent variable changes values, the dependent variable will respond to that. If it's truly connected, that's kind of what you're looking for, in a certain way that kind of indicates that the independent variable is causing a change on the dependent variable. But of course, in messy situations like organizations, we often have things called extraneous variables, things that we can't really control or sometimes even observe. So in this case, the fact that they have a major leak in their house is an extraneous variable that may be affecting both the independent variable and the dependent variable. So this is a little diagram, a schematic of a typical experimental sort of design, but it gets across the idea of how the variables interact with each other. So we should all be aware of the famous Hawthorne experiments, which involve trying to measure the effects of different physical conditions on productivity in the Hawthorne electric plant in Chicago. So start out with a dependent variable, and in the Hawthorne experiments they use several different types of independent variables, but let's just focus on one, which is usually, when it's discussed in textbooks, is the most famous one, which was the level of lighting. So the experimenters, most famously known as Elton Mayo, would vary the lighting. So they'd put, sometimes in the factory floor, they'd have low lighting at various levels, and sometimes they would have high lighting or normal lighting so that people could see better what they were doing. And they were trying to measure whether the level of lighting on the factory floor would influence the dependent variable, which was how fast the people working there could assemble armatures, or they were wrapping wires around the armature base. So here they have measurable variables. They know what level of lighting they're using. They can have a scale to indicate that. And they can measure how many armature windings are being produced to see whether there's a relationship between the level of lighting and the level of productivity. Okay, this is kind of a classic experiment to see whether lighting affects productivity. And the expectation was it probably would. I mean, when you go into an experiment and go into a study, and this will be true, as you write your papers and you start thinking about your dissertation, you have some idea about what the results are going to be, or you're hoping, so you know what you're going to be looking for. So obviously the researchers thought there would probably be a relationship between some of these independent variables and the dependent variable. But lo and behold, there appeared to be no connection between the level of lighting and the level of productivity. And this, of course, blew everybody's mind, because that was kind of what they were looking for. So what happened? Well, it turned out the extraneous variable that they had not expected was the relationship that occurred within the factory floor and between the people, and also between the people and the researchers. And the conclusions as a result of this experiment was that the social environment, because the workplace is social, the level of productivity is significantly affected by the human relationships that are going on. And it turned out the workers who felt like they were being singled out as being special because the researchers would talk to them, did better work because they thought they were being observed and their work was being singled out as being special. Okay, so here we found a situation where the variables that we thought we were measuring turned out to be not the influence that we thought, but extraneous variables which had not been previously considered and were not being controlled for, turned out to confound the initial experiment, but turned out to produce long-lasting results, so that we know that human relations in the workplace have a huge effect on how people work, how they're satisfied with their job, the productivity levels, and all kinds of different things. This led to a whole movement called the human relations movement in management theory. So, pay attention to your coworkers. All this is kind of leading up to the week 7 paper, because you'll be reviewing all the research, all the literature that we've covered in weeks 5, 6, and 7. And I'd also like you to review kind of where we started from the class, where we're looking at strategic management as a new field, and whether what the purpose of theory is, and the difference between theory and practice in this particular area. So the week 7 paper, since it's going to be built upon the weeks 5, week 6, and week 7, you should be kind of thinking ahead about what approach you might take, and thinking, well, what's my thesis statement going to be? What am I going to be trying to be showing in this paper? And that's the one takeaway I think that almost everybody has received feedback on, is you're used to writing a descriptive paper. You're describing what's in the literature, which is okay. That's fine. But you have to start using that literature, that knowledge of that literature, to make a particular argument for a particular position or a particular thesis, okay? And that moves you from a descriptive style of writing to a argumentative or expository style of writing, where you're trying to make a point. You have to think, what's my point going to be, and what information do I need to be able to make that point? Okay, any questions, you know how to get in touch with me, but the keys to success for this week are based upon Wally. And he's talking to the intern. It says, ASIC, the key to success is not caring what others think of you. However, coincidentally, that is also the key to being totally useless. But the important thing is that other people can't tell which way you're hoping it goes. Well, we have a few other keys to success also. Use the feedback and previous work in your new work. Use it in your discussion posts. Use it in your papers. And then look for ways to improve. If many of you are writing well, you have good writing style, it's clear, you're satisfying all the basic requirements, but really there's always something to do better. And you may say, well, I got an A, what more can I do? Look at the feedback I give you. Generally, I'll say, here's the next step for you. This is what you need to do next. So that's about it for this week. This is a shorter lecture than usual. But again, we're kind of repeating, in terms of the assignments, we're repeating the assignment that we did last week. But I want you to be looking ahead and thinking about how you're going to write your 3rd paper. So until next time, goodbye and good luck.